April 1944. The fields of Normandy are silent except for the low rumble of engines approaching through the morning mist. A column of German Panzer IVs waits along a hedgerow, their crews calm, confident veterans of the Eastern Front. They have fought T-34s and Churchills and lived to tell about it. Through their binoculars, they now spot shapes moving along the road below boxy silhouettes with high turrets and thin armor glinting in the light. The German commander smirks. Shermans, he says. American toys. His gunner laughs, and in that brief moment of arrogance, history turns against them. Minutes later, tracer fire arcs across the fields. One Panzer explodes in a burst of flame. Another's turret is blown clean off. The laughter fades into screams, swallowed by the thunder of returning fire. 2 years earlier, that same laughter echoed inside German training schools and engineering halls. American tanks had just begun arriving in North Africa awkward and tall, their 75mm guns underpowered against the German 88s. To the Wehrmacht, they were a joke, evidence that the industrial giant across the Atlantic could produce quantity, not quality. In reports from the Africa Corps officers, mocked the M4 Sherman as a walking coffin, a steel box for amateurs, and proof that the Americans build for comfort, not for war. Even German propaganda films featured scenes of Shermans bursting into flames, reinforcing the myth of German superiority in armored warfare. But what none of them understood was that this so-called weakness was about to become the most decisive strength of the entire war. By 1944, those same walking coffins were crossing Europe like a tide of steel. More than 40,000 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines. Every one of them shared the same philosophy: easy to build, easy to repair, easy to replace. The Germans built masterpieces, machines of elegance and precision, crafted like watches. The Americans built hammers, and in total war, it was the hammer that endured. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces advanced beyond the beaches, the Shermans' reputation changed from ridicule to respect. German soldiers began referring to them bitterly as Tommy Cookers that never seemed to stop coming. No matter how many were destroyed, more appeared the next morning. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago were producing tanks faster than German intelligence could count them. What had once seemed like crude mass production revealed itself as a new kind of weapon logistics itself. The irony was perfect. The tank that German engineers had dismissed as weak was now the instrument burning their armored divisions to the ground. Yet behind every machine stood men crews who trusted their steel companions, not because they were invincible, but because they could be repaired, replaced, and returned to battle within days. In war, reliability was more powerful than perfection. This is the story of how the Allies won, not by building the strongest tank, but by understanding the mathematics of survival. It's about how laughter became fear, how arrogance became defeat, and how the most underestimated machine of World War II turned into the symbol of industrial dominance. The Germans mocked the Sherman tank. The war taught them otherwise. If you believe victory belongs to those who adapt, not those who boast, type the number 7 in the comments. And if you want to uncover more untold stories from the war that reshaped our world, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will show why the laugh that started in 1942 ended in silence by 1945. In 1942, while Allied tanks struggled across the deserts of North Africa, German officers gathered around their Panzer maps with a quiet certainty that they owned the future of armored warfare. The Wehrmacht's armored corps had perfected a doctrine of speed coordination and fear. Their Panzer IVs and newly arrived Tigers dominated the battlefield with thick armor and devastating guns. Against them, the American M4 Sherman looked like a factory mistake, too tall, too thin, too ordinary. When German intelligence first examined captured Shermans from the battles of Tunisia, they couldn't believe what they saw. The tank's armor was just over 2 inches thick. Its 75mm gun, the same caliber as an outdated Panzer IV, could barely scratch the frontal armor of a Tiger. Even the silhouette was a gift to any enemy gunner, almost 3 meters tall, easy to spot, impossible to hide. In reports sent back to Berlin, engineers wrote dismissively, "The Americans produce a machine for transport, not combat. It is an industrial toy." That tone of superiority ran deep in the German mindset. For years, Nazi propaganda had cultivated an image of German craftsmanship precision above all complexity as proof of genius. Tanks were built like sculptures, each component refined by hand. Every Tiger that left the factory represented 300,000 man-hours and the work of hundreds of specialists. It was engineering as art, but also engineering chained to its own perfectionism. Across the ocean, American factories were rewriting the rules. When the Detroit Arsenal tank plant began full production of the M4, it operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Instead of master craftsmen, there were factory workers, mechanics, welders, and women who had never touched a tank before the war. To German eyes, this was sacrilege. How could a tank built by ordinary people challenge their steel masterpieces? The answer would come, but not yet. In 1942 and 1943, on the battlefields of Kasserine and Elgueter, the Sherman seemed to confirm every German prejudice. Tigers shrugged off direct hits that bounced harmlessly off their armor. Allied tank crews joked grimly that they were riding Ronson's tanks that lit up the first time every time. Fire from German 88mm guns could pierce a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away. For the Germans, it was proof that the enemy didn't understand armored war. They saw themselves as hunters, their tanks as predators moving in small, coordinated packs. The Americans, by contrast, were clumsy and inexperienced, attacking in straight lines, learning painful lessons, one burning tank at a time. In his diary, a German panzer commander near Kairouan wrote, "The enemy's courage is admirable, but their machines are hopeless. They send metal boxes into the desert to die." What none of them saw, however, was the hidden logic behind those metal boxes. Each destroyed Sherman could be replaced within weeks. Every tank that burned was part of a learning curve that America could afford, and Germany could not. By the time the Africa Corps was retreating toward Tunisia, American production lines were already preparing the next generation of Shermans upgraded and improved. Every defeat fed the machine. The Germans laughed because they measured power by armor thickness and gun size. The Americans measured it by output per month, fuel per mile, and hours of maintenance per tank. To one side, war was an art. To the other, it was an equation. And equations once solved don't change their answer. In a confidential intelligence meeting in late 1943, a German officer summarized the situation with smug certainty. "The Americans have too much steel and too little soul." He was half right. They did have too much steel, but it would be that excess multiplied by factories and fueled by ordinary men and women that would bury his army within 2 years. They laughed because they thought the war would be won by brilliance. They were wrong because it was won by persistence. If you still believe quality beats quantity, leave a like. But if you think survival favors those who learn faster and adapt wider, comment the number 7. Because in the next chapter, we'll go inside the factories that turned American steel into the weapon that burned the laughter out of the Reich. In the winter of 1941, the United States was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The nation had factories, manpower, and raw materials, but no army ready for a global war. What it did have was the one thing Germany could never match: industrial imagination. When Washington realized it would need thousands of tanks, not hundreds, the War Department didn't look to traditional arms manufacturers. It called Detroit. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant rose out of farmland in just 11 months, built by Chrysler with the speed and precision of a race against time. It was the first factory in the world designed solely to mass-produce tanks. Before a single Sherman had seen combat, assembly lines were already running 3 shifts a day. Conveyor belts moved turrets, engines, and hulls through a choreography of sparks and smoke. The air smelled of grease and metal, and the rhythm of hammers never stopped. To the engineers overseeing it, the Sherman wasn't just a machine, it was a system. Every bolt, every weld, every part had to be interchangeable. A transmission made in Illinois had to fit perfectly into a hull welded in Ohio. This philosophy, called modular production, meant any damaged Sherman could be stripped, repaired, and returned to combat within days. It also meant that dozens of subcontractors across the country, Ford Pressed Steel Car Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, could all build different components that fit together seamlessly. The contrast with Germany could not have been sharper. While German factories were scattered under constant bombing and obsessed with perfection, American assembly lines measured progress in hours, not weeks. In 1943 alone, the United States produced more tanks than Germany built during the entire war. By the time the first Tiger rolled off the line, dozens of Sherman variants were already fighting on 3 continents. The human side of that production was no less extraordinary. In Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, millions of workers, many of them women, answered the call. They learned to weld armor plates, calibrate guns, and test engines. They became part of what newspapers called the arsenal of democracy. In letters, home workers wrote not about profit but purpose. One mechanic named Harold Jennings wrote to his mother, "I never held a rifle, but every bolt I tighten might bring someone's son home." On the factory floor, slogans hung from steel beams: "We build strength. We build freedom." The Sherman success was not a miracle of design. It was a miracle of organization. Its power came from repetition. Its reliability came from millions of ordinary hands doing one extraordinary job perfectly over and over again. That's why commanders in Europe trusted it. A Sherman might not win every duel, but it would always be there for the next one. When one burned, another rolled off the ship. When one bogged down in mud, 2 more followed the same road an hour later. By 1944, more than 40,000 M4 Shermans had been built. Entire divisions of steel advanced across continents, fueled by a supply chain so vast that even German intelligence analysts couldn't believe the numbers. For every Panzer that left a factory in occupied Czechoslovakia, 15 Shermans were already crossing the Atlantic. Inside those American factories, the idea of war had changed. It was no longer about heroism. In a single battle, it was about endurance. Engineers didn't dream of invincibility. They dreamed of replaceability. That philosophy made the Sherman the perfect weapon for a long war, a war of logistics and attrition where time, not armor, was the deciding factor. As one Allied general later said, Germany built the best tanks in the world. America built the best army in the world. It wasn't the roar of the engine or the thickness of the steel that frightened the Germans. It was the realization that no matter how many they destroyed, the Shermans would keep coming. If you believe victory belongs to those who outwork their enemy, comment the number 7. And if you think the real battlefield wasn't in Normandy or Tunisia, but on the assembly lines of America, stay until the next part where we'll break down the cold mathematics that turned a so-called weak tank into a statistical weapon of mass destruction. War is not just fought with courage or machines. It is fought with numbers, cold, relentless, unforgiving numbers. By 1944, those numbers had already chosen their side. In the quiet offices of the War Production Board in Washington, charts told a story that no general on the battlefield could ignore. Every 20 minutes somewhere in America, a brand new Sherman tank rolled off an assembly line. Every 20 minutes around the clock, 7 days a week. At that same moment in Germany, it could take 2 weeks to complete a single Tiger. The math was brutal, and the outcome inevitable. To understand why the Sherman triumphed, one must first understand the arithmetic of war. A Tiger weighed almost 60 tons, required a factory team of specialists, and consumed twice as much fuel as a Sherman. It broke down often, its complex transmission strained by its own mass, its enormous engine overheating on long marches. Even when a Tiger was undamaged in battle, it was frequently immobilized by mechanical failure or lack of spare parts. A division commander in Normandy once reported that only 1 in every 3 German tanks was operational at any given time. The rest were stranded by their own perfection. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed around a single word: reliability. It could run on different fuel grades, start in freezing rain, and be repaired in a field with a wrench and a torch. Its engine was simple, its components interchangeable, its maintenance measured in hours, not days. A complete engine swap could be done in 3 hours, a full overhaul in less than a day. To German crews, these numbers sounded impossible. To American mechanics, they were routine. Then came logistics, the true invisible weapon of the Allies. The United States built not just tanks, but an entire ecosystem to feed them. Cargo ships carried spare parts packed in numbered crates, each corresponding to maintenance manuals already distributed to field depots. Fuel arrived on scheduled tires, and tools followed behind. The Germans called it the machine that feeds itself. They were right. While the Tiger burned 100 gallons of fuel just to travel 50 miles, the Sherman could cross nearly twice that distance on the same amount. It meant that a Sherman unit could move, fight, and relocate without paralyzing the supply line. On the map of war, this translated into reach strategic flexibility that allowed Allied armor to flow like water around German strongpoints. Quantity wasn't just more. It was faster, lighter, and more adaptable. By late 1943, American analysts had reduced the chaos of war into equations. They calculated that for every Tiger built, 5 Shermans could be produced, shipped, fueled, and crewed. In a direct duel, one Tiger might destroy 2 or 3 Shermans before falling, but the math still favored the Americans. The Germans could not replace their losses. The Americans could before lunch. Even in training, the contrast was staggering. A German tank crew might receive less than 100 hours in simulators and field drills before being thrown into battle. An American crew trained for nearly 400 hours with live ammunition and standardized tactics drilled by repetition. They learned to fight as a network, not as lone machines. When one Sherman was destroyed, the others already knew what to do. They did not need to be perfect, they only needed to be enough. As the Allies pushed through France, the arithmetic became undeniable. German officers began reporting what they called the equation of exhaustion. For every panzer company destroyed, there were always more Shermans replacing it the next morning. A Tiger that needed a new gearbox could sit idle for weeks. A Sherman could have one installed overnight. In battle, that difference was life and death. By the time the Wehrmacht realized it was fighting not an army, but an industry, it was too late. The math had turned into a weapon of its own. The Americans had transformed factories into front lines and blueprints into strategies. General George S. Patton once said, "Quantity has a quality all its own. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth, measured in smoke and steel." The Sherman was not the best tank on the battlefield. It didn't need to be. It only needed to be there again and again until the enemy's ability to fight was consumed by the weight of production. War historians would later call this the tyranny of numbers, but for the men who fought inside those tanks, it felt simpler than that. It was survival through repetition. It was knowing that no matter what happened today, the line would move forward tomorrow. Because something stronger than fear was driving it, the factory whistle back home. If you agree that war isn't about perfection, but persistence, type the number 7 in the comments. And if you think what comes next, the moment when the Sherman finally turned from survivor to hunter, matters, most stay for the next part, where the laughter of the panzer crews finally burned away under the fire of their own arrogance. Normandy, June 1944. The morning fog clung to the hedgerows like smoke before battle. On a narrow country road near Villers-Bocage, the first line of Sherman tanks moved cautiously forward, their engines growling under the weight of mud and fear. Inside one of them, Sergeant Paul Wilkins wiped sweat from his palms and whispered to his gunner, "Keep your eyes on the tree line." The war had changed. This was not the open desert of North Africa. This was a maze of hedgerows where every turn could hide a tiger. When the first shot came, it sounded like thunder. A Panzer shell tore through the leading Sherman, setting it ablaze in seconds. The convoy halted, smoke rising into the gray sky. Somewhere up ahead, a German Tiger waited invisible among the trees, its gun barrel already turning for the next kill. For years, the Germans had ruled armored warfare with confidence born from experience. But that confidence was about to meet something far more dangerous than raw power. It was about to meet adaptation. By mid-1944, the American and British forces had begun to change the rules of engagement. Gone were the days of charging head-on against better guns. Tank crews learned to fight like hunters, not targets. They called it shoot-and-scoot strike from the flanks move and disappear before the German guns could return fire. The Allies had also introduced a new variant that terrified even the most seasoned panzer crews, the Sherman Firefly. Equipped with the British 17-pounder gun, the Firefly could penetrate the armor of a Tiger from over 1,000 meters away. For the first time, the hunters could be hunted. At Villers-Bocage, that reality hit hard. As German ace Michael Wittmann led his Tigers into the village, his confidence bordered on arrogance. In less than 15 minutes, his tank destroyed an entire British column vehicles trucks and several Shermans. But the counterattack that followed changed everything. Allied tank commanders regrouped, flanked his position, and used their numbers and coordination to encircle the German spearhead. In the chaos that followed, Wittmann's Tiger was hit multiple times, its turret torn apart by explosions. The invincible predator was gone, consumed by the very fire it once unleashed. Across Normandy, this pattern repeated itself. Tigers and Panthers were lethal in duels, but duels were no longer how the Allies fought. They swarmed coordinated and called in airstrikes when necessary. Overhead, the thunder of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons became a sound every German tanker dreaded. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds rockets, hissing toward their targets. The combination was devastating Shermans on the ground, forcing tanks to reveal their position and aircraft above, turning those positions into infernos. The Germans called it Der Stahlsturm, the storm of steel. In the Bocage of France, Panthers and Tigers burned not from single hits but from the overwhelming pressure of relentless coordination. For every German tank that destroyed a Sherman, 5 more appeared from different angles. The Sherman's lighter weight allowed them to cross bridges the Tigers couldn't, to maneuver through mud that trapped heavier tanks, and to repair in hours what would immobilize a panzer for days. The battlefield no longer belonged to the most powerful, it belonged to the most persistent. By August 1944, the once proud panzer divisions were in retreat. At the Falaise Pocket, Allied forces closed in from all sides, trapping what remained of the German 7th Army. Reports from the battlefield described miles of wreckage Panthers, with their turrets blown off, Tigers split open like tin cans, black smoke rising from the wrecks of the machines once called invincible. The heat of battle turned their armor into twisted metal, but the true heat came from the relentless pace of Allied attack fire maneuver, resupply, and repeat. One captured German officer, when interrogated after Falaise, was asked what broke his army. His answer was simple: "Your tanks never stopped coming. We killed 1, and 10 more appeared. We fired until the barrels glowed red, and still you came." That was the moment the laughter died. The same crews who once mocked the Sherman now feared the sound of its engine and the sight of its silhouette in the distance. It was no longer just a tank. It was a promise that the Americans would not stop until Europe was free. The burning of the Panthers was not just the destruction of machines. It was the death of an idea, the myth that brilliance could overcome endurance, that perfection could outlast production. If you believe that arrogance is the first casualty of war, type the number 7 in the comments. And if you think victory belongs not to those who fire first, but to those who never stop firing back, stay for the next chapter, where we leave the battlefield and step inside the armor itself to meet the men who fought and survived within the steel beasts that changed the world. A Sherman tank was more than a weapon. It was a home, a heartbeat, and sometimes a coffin. Inside its steel walls lived 5 men bound not by orders but by survival: the commander, the gunner, the loader, the driver, and the assistant driver. Each had a task so specific that if one failed, All died together. The air inside was thick with oil and sweat. When the engine roared, every bolt vibrated. When the main gun fired, the recoil kicked through their bodies like a physical reminder that life was measured in reloads and seconds. For these men, fear was constant, but familiarity made it bearable. They named their tanks Ruthless Liberty Bell Home Again, Lucky 7. Names reminded them of something worth returning to. In letters home, commanders described the inside of a Sherman as loud as hell and hotter than sin. Yet they trusted it. Unlike many German tanks, the Sherman gave them a chance to live through a hit. Its designers had built it with escape hatches on both sides and a relatively light internal structure that allowed the crew to bail out quickly when fire erupted. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible, and that mattered more than perfection. In the thick hedgerows of Normandy, Private Joe Ramirez from Texas learned that lesson firsthand. His tank took a direct hit from an anti-tank shell that tore through the engine compartment, setting it ablaze. The commander shouted for the crew to evacuate. Joe's hands burned as he opened the side hatch, dragging his gunner out through smoke so thick he could barely breathe. Moments later, the tank exploded. Both men were thrown to the ground alive but shaken. When medics reached them, Joe's only words were, "She did her job. She got us out." Stories like that spread faster than any official report. Crews began to trust the Sherman not because it was indestructible, but because it protected them when everything else failed. Engineers had thought of that from the start. The armor was arranged in sloped plates to deflect shots. Ammunition was stored in wet racks surrounded by water jackets to prevent explosions. Even the driver's seat was designed to absorb impact in case of sudden hits. It wasn't elegant engineering, it was human engineering. Every feature was there for one purpose: to give 5 men a few more seconds to escape death. In the Battle of the Bulge, during one of the coldest winters in European history, that design saved countless lives. When German shells ripped through Allied lines near Bastogne, Shermans kept moving. Drivers maneuvered across frozen roads, loaders worked with numb fingers, and commanders shouted targets through radios crackling with static. The tanks were battered and burned, but they kept fighting. When fuel ran low, crews siphoned gasoline from destroyed vehicles. When ammunition ran out, they scavenged rounds from wrecks. The tanks were tools, but the will to keep them alive came from the men inside. Psychologists later noted that Sherman crews developed an unusually deep emotional attachment to their machines. They cleaned them, patched bullet holes, and talked to them before missions. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was faith. To the soldiers who lived through artillery barrages and ambushes, the tank was a friend that would carry them home if they treated it right. And in many cases it did. In one diary found after the war, a gunner named Thomas Caldwell wrote, "People talk about bravery. I don't think we were brave. We were just 5 men who refused to let go of each other." That was the real heart of the Sherman 5: human lives synchronized in noise, heat, and danger. Every turn of the turret, every reload, every shouted order was a rhythm of trust. For the men inside, war was not about glory or revenge. It was about keeping each other alive long enough to see the next dawn. The Sherman didn't win the war because it was the best tank. It won because it carried the best of humanity within it: discipline, resilience, and loyalty. If you believe courage isn't the absence of fear but the strength to face it together, type the number 7 in the comments. And stay for the final part, where we'll step back from the noise of battle to see what the laughter of 1942 became when the smoke cleared in 1945, and why the tank, once mocked as weak, became the machine that defined victory. By the spring of 1945, the landscape of Europe had been transformed. Cities lay in ruins, bridges were blown, and once proud panzer divisions existed more on paper than in reality. On the roads and fields where German engineers had once laughed at the walking coffins rolling from American factories, only silence remained. The tanks they had mocked were everywhere, Sherman's Fireflies, and their newer variants still moving, still fighting, still relentless. What had begun as a joke had become a nightmare. In captured German war rooms, officers studied reports with disbelief. Intelligence summaries detailed not only the technical specifications of the Sherman, but its production numbers. By May 1945, the United States had built over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Each could be repaired, replaced, and redeployed faster than the Germans could destroy it. Tiger and Panther crews who survived until this point wrote bitter notes in their diaries acknowledging that no matter how superior their engineering had seemed, the industrial might of the Americans had turned the tide. Field accounts confirmed it. Entire panzer brigades had been destroyed not in single heroic battles, but gradually under the weight of logistics numbers and adaptability. Units once thought invincible were cut apart by coordinated attacks, airstrikes, and relentless waves of Shermans exploiting mobility, flank, and surprise. The math of production, the planning of supply lines, and the endurance of ordinary crews had done what individual skill could not overwhelm the Wehrmacht entirely. The human cost of victory was staggering on both sides. Allied crews had risked life and limb, but for every Sherman lost, dozens more took its place. The Germans lost not only machines, but experienced skill and morale. By the end, the average German tank commander had fewer than 30 hours of combat experience. The average Sherman crew had over 200. For the men who had once laughed at the boxy American tanks each encounter had become a lesson in fear and humility. On battlefields across Europe, the irony was complete. Soldiers who had once ridiculed the Sherman as a toy found themselves facing the unrelenting advance of these same machines. A veteran of the 7th Panzer, writing years later, recalled, "We laughed in 1942. By 1944, we ran. By 1945, we hid. The sound of those engines and the sight of those tanks meant death." The laughter that had once defined German confidence had died, replaced by a cold understanding of American industrial supremacy. Yet the story is not just about machines, it is about people. The ordinary men and women in factories, the crews inside the steel boxes, the planners who calculated the mathematics of war, and the engineers who designed a tank around repairability and endurance rather than perfection. Their vision and labor carried not just tanks, but survival hope and ultimately victory. As the Allies moved through Germany, Sherman tanks continued to roll past bombed-out cities unchallenged, except by the remnants of a defeated army. In quiet moments after the war, German officers and engineers inspected the captured Shermans. They marveled at the simplicity, the durability, and the numbers. For all their advanced technology, they could not compete with a system designed to endure loss and adapt. The tanks that had once been mocked had redefined armored warfare and rewritten the rules of industrial combat. The Sherman's legacy extended beyond victory in Europe. It demonstrated that wars are not won solely by brilliant speed or armor thickness, but by the combination of preparation, production, human ingenuity, and resilience. It proved that a machine designed to preserve human life as much as to destroy the enemy could alter the course of history. If you believe that persistence, ingenuity, and human courage can outweigh arrogance and technological superiority, type the number 7 in the comments. If you disagree or have a different view, give this video a like. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next story in our series where machines once laughed at by their enemies become legends that shape the world. The Sherman tank entered the war as a target of mockery and left it as a symbol of unstoppable resolve. The laughter had died. The war had spoken.